Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of John Quincy Adams, and the focus is corrupt bargain with a question mark. The year is 1824, and it's going to be the most wide-open presidential election in American history. James Monroe will be stepping down, and there are 5 legitimate candidates running for this office. The two-party system had kind of disintegrated, so there were no party leaders that were jockeying for the top 2 spots. You've got 3 people from Monroe's cabinet: Quincy Adams, Secretary of State; William Crawford, Secretary of the Treasury; John Calhoun, the Secretary of War. Plus, you've got the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, and a bit of a wild card in the new senator from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the former Major General from the U.S. Army, getting a lot of support out west. And the West is starting to have much more of a say in American politics. A lot more people moving out west, and the western states are starting to expand the franchise to give the vote to more and more people. And so the West would definitely have a say in this election in 1824. But with 5 candidates in play, it was not a surprise that no one won a majority in the Electoral College. Jackson had the lead with 99 votes. Adams was second with 84. Then you've got Crawford with 41. Now, he had just had a stroke, pretty debilitating stroke, a couple of months before, but he stayed in the race. He finished third in the Electoral College, which was crucial because Henry Clay was edged out into 4th place with 37 votes. A difference of 4 between Crawford and Clay was actually quite significant because only the top 3 vote getters per the 12th Amendment would be going to the House of Representatives to define who would be the next president of the United States. If Clay had finished ahead of Crawford, he could easily have used his influence and popularity in the House to be a compromise candidate against the Jackson and Adams folks and actually become the next president of the United States. But instead, he would be looked to influence that outcome as opposed to being involved in the decision itself. By the way, John Calhoun, where was he? He had opted out of the race to focus on the vice presidency, hoping that he could run for president perhaps from that point sometime in the future. So the vote is going to take place in the House of Representatives among these top 3, and there's a lot of interest in where Henry Clay is going to stand in providing his support. Now, the clear path to that support was going to be for John Quincy Adams. Well, why? First of all, they were aligned on policy. Clay had developed what he called his American system with a lot of federally funded internal improvements, high protective tariffs as part of that package. Well, these were policy areas that John Quincy Adams was aligned with, so it would not be surprising that Clay would support Adams on policy. Now, in terms of personality, it would not be a surprise that Clay would have nothing to do with Andrew Jackson because they despised each other. They were completely different on policy as well, but Clay had been among the leaders in trying to censure Jackson when, as a general, he had sort of gone beyond his instructions in the Seminole Wars from a few years before. And Clay was out front in trying to get Jackson censured, and that's something certainly Jackson never forgot nor forgave, so they didn't like each other at all, were not aligned on policy. This would not be a surprise that Clay would support John Quincy Adams. But Adams then makes a mistake. January 9th, 1825, Adams agrees to a one-on-one meeting with Clay. Nobody else in the room, and if you look at Adams's contemporaneous notes, there was nothing wrong with this. Now, remember, Adams is actually one of the most noted diarists in presidential history. He wrote down everything, his facts, his opinions, his thoughts in voluminous detail, and he wrote a contemporaneous account of this meeting with Henry Clay. According to Adams, the time had now come at which he, Clay, might be explicit in his communication with me, and he had for that purpose asked for this confidential interview. He wished me, as far as I might think proper, to satisfy him with regard to some principles of great public importance, but without any personal considerations for himself. In the question to come before the House between General Jackson, Mr. Crawford, and myself, he had no hesitation in saying that his preference would be for me. And this would not be a surprise, and there's no reason to doubt, frankly, the words that Adams put in his diary. This was something that he wrote about every day, and it should be considered a reliable contemporaneous account. Nevertheless, the public perception of this meeting started to take on a life of its own as Jackson's supporters started crying foul. Some kind of quid pro quo deal was in the offing, where Clay was going to be given a spot in the cabinet, probably Secretary of State, in terms of giving his support to Adams in sort of an illicit deal. Well, we then fast forward a month later and the vote is taken in the House of Representatives, and sure enough, Quincy Adams wins on the first ballot. He gets 13 states. You've got Jackson second with 7. Crawford actually got 4. It's the only time in American history where the winner of the popular vote and the Electoral College vote does not become president. Now, for John Quincy Adams, this is a huge victory and a major moment in his life. He writes his father that the most important day of my life, oppressed with the magnitude of the task before me, but cheered with the hope of that generous support for my fellow citizens, which in the vicissitudes of a life devoted to their service has never failed to sustain me. He's ready to move forward. But Andrew Jackson is not. Jackson was convinced that there was a quid pro quo deal that they started calling a corrupt bargain. And that label was delivered incessantly, both during the interregnum and during Adams's presidency. Jackson's supporters never gave up. Over and over and over again. Corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain. Now, Adams wasn't going to engage in this. He was president, he was moving forward. Henry Clay was highly offended by this, and he said just shortly into Adams's presidency that I do not believe General Jackson so competent to discharge the various intricate and complex duties of the office of Chief Magistrate as his competitor. If he has exhibited either in the councils of the Union or in those of his own state or territory the qualities of a statesman, the evidence of the fact has escaped my observation. Of Mr. Adams, it is but truth and justice to say that he is highly gifted, profoundly learned, and long and greatly experienced in public affairs at home and abroad. But these earnest feelings and sentiments from Henry Clay pretty much fell on deaf ears because Jackson's supporters were rabid and they were convinced that a corrupt bargain had in fact taken place. It was a cloud over Adams's entire presidency. And it didn't go away. It came back in spades in 1828 when the next election cycle came around and Jackson and Adams were going to be running against each other once again. The press started with this, putting it out there that it was Duff Green, one of the voices of Jackson in the press. He had his U.S. Telegraph newspaper. He put it out there that he had proof from a congressman who said he had proof that in fact the quid pro quo deal was initiated and consummated. And the way it was pitched was that this congressman, a senator, had been asked by Clay to go to all 3 candidates and see if any of them would offer Secretary of State in return for the votes. Well, it turns out that this senator was the future president, James Buchanan. And when Buchanan's name got out there, Buchanan said, no, that is not what happened. And this was a terrible spot to put Buchanan in because he wanted Jackson to have him in his favor. This was not going to help him politically. But he came out and said that had I ever known or even suspected that General Jackson believed I had been sent to him by Mr. Clay or his friends, I should immediately have corrected his erroneous impression and thus prevented the necessity for this most unpleasant explanation. One of the low moments of James Buchanan's life, and he had a few, awkward, embarrassing, but it still didn't set the record straight. It seemed like almost nothing would have actually swayed Jackson's supporters who were absolutely convinced a corrupt bargain had occurred. Well, it's not a surprise after a not very consequential presidency for John Quincy Adams and all of this rabid support for the General Jackson that Jackson wins the presidency in 1828. In fact, it's not even close. It's also the most populous vote to date. In fact, more than 3 times the number of people voted in this presidential election than the one before. It topped 1 million voters for the first time in U.S. Presidential history, and those western states had a lot to do with it. There were more popular votes from states like Ohio and Kentucky and Tennessee than there were for Virginia and Massachusetts, which still had more clamps down on who was actually accessing the franchise. So the whole nature of democracy is evolving. Andrew Jackson is heading into the White House. Well, for the only time in his life, John Quincy Adams then spoke about this so-called corrupt bargain. And he did it to defend Henry Clay. He felt he owed Clay that in a very lengthy statement. We'll tell you, since it was only the one time that Quincy Adams spoke about it, here's what he said. Prejudice and passion have charged him, Clay, with obtaining that office by bargain and corruption. Before you, my fellow citizens, in the presence of our country and heaven, I pronounce that charge totally unfounded. As to my motives for tendering to him the Department of State when I did, let that man who questions them come forward. Let him look around among statesmen and legislatures of this nation and of that day. Let him then select and name the man whom, by preeminent talents, by his splendid services, by his ardent patriotism, by his all-embracing public spirit, by his fervent eloquence in behalf of the rights and liberties of mankind, and by his long experience in the affairs of the Union, foreign and domestic, a President of the United States, intent only upon the welfare and honor of his country, ought to have preferred to Henry Clay. Let him name the man, and then judge you, my fellow citizens, of my motives. Well, he came out only with one statement, but it was a bold, strong statement echoed from what his contemporaneous notes established back in 1824, that there was nothing illicit about this. Quincy Adams and Clay had a meeting, fine. But they were aligned politically. They were more aligned personally, certainly, than Clay was with Jackson. And as Adams just said, Clay was the most qualified person for this position, and that's why he got that job. It seems to me that the time has come that we eliminate this phrase corrupt bargain from our historical reference. I mean, these concepts tend to stick, and you get a catchy phrase in there and it keeps going and going and going throughout historical reference. But this is more in the category of propaganda, or some might in the contemporaneous days of today call fake news, or even a big lie. That's what the corrupt bargain was. It's time to take it out of the history books because it's not history. It was propaganda, fake news, a big lie. It was one of those. It was not history, and it deserves to be taken out of the history books. That is John Quincy Adams and Corrupt Bargain ? Which we will update right now to change the title to be Corrupt Bargain No, from the life of John Quincy Adams. For more Presidential Chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.